If you look at chapter 27, almost the entire story of Solomon, because he doesn't only talk to ants, he also talks to a bird,
Right.
the hoopoe bird.
That's right.
Name known as the hoopoe bird because of hoopoo, hoopoo. That story of the hoopoe bird and Solomon, that story, along with the ants, and also everything that the hoopoe bird does, flies down to Sheba, meets the Queen of Sheba, who talks to him as well. So here, both the Queen of Sheba can talk to birds, and Solomon can talk to birds. Well, that's a little bit more understandable because birds do make sounds, and you can pick that up with your ear. Anyway, she comes up with the hoopoe bird up to meet Solomon because he's too busy marching his birds, getting them ready for battle, left, right, and they fly up over the enemy and they drop stones with the name of the enemy on the bottom of the stones, and they kill the enemy that way. Now, that is, when she comes then to the court of Solomon, there, opens the door into the throne room. Solomon's sitting on his throne. She's across, comes in the door. As she's about ready to cross out, there is a pond. And she sees it, and she picks up her skirts to keep from getting wet. That's where the story ends in chapter 27, verse 44. It's from verse 17 to verse 44 you see this whole story,
Right.
including the ants that we've just talked about in verse 18 and 19. Now, that story is borrowed story. That's not in your Bible. I never saw that. I would have loved to have had that story in my Bible. I missed out in Sunday school because we never had such an engaging story. And there'd be movies could have been made about this, and I would have loved those movies. The reason why it's not in the Bible is because this is an apocryphal account. This is a Jewish apocryphal account. It comes from the second Targum of Esther. Second Targum of Esther, you can go to your library, you can even pick it out. That's the source for this. That was written in the 2nd century. This book was compiled in the 7th to 8th century. The Jews that had contact with the compilers of the Quran, you notice I'm being very careful not to say Muhammad. That's why I jumped on you the other time. Whoever wrote this book had access to these stories, not to the biblical stories, for one very good historical reason. The biblical stories of Solomon, the true stories of Solomon and Sheba and all that happened in the Old Testament, had yet to be translated into Arabic. These were not translated until the 8th century. Therefore, whoever put the Quran together did not have access to the authoritative story. They just had access to the ones the Jews were giving them over the fires, the camel fires, the caravan fires at night. Those stories were apocryphal accounts. They were already translated into Arabic. That's why the Arab writers picked up these stories, like the Second Targum of Esther, written in the 2nd century. They wrote it in the 7th or 8th century. That's why you find them in Surah chapter 27.
You know
no Jew in their right mind would go to Second Targum of Esther to say what Solomon did. Why? Ask any Jew, and they'll tell you. These are nothing more than children's fables.
That's right. I mean, rabbinic teaching, Talmud, Midrash, who knows?
All of these were more like children's fables. They were taught to kids like bedtime stories, but they would take these stories that they heard from as they would be traveling, because remember, most of them were in the diaspora. They had been thrown out of Jerusalem in 70 AD at the destruction of the temple. They had to move out into the diaspora. They took their scriptures with them, wrapped up in their scrolls. Those they protected. They didn't let anybody read them. But what they would tell the kids at nighttime were these stories they heard. They were counting from other sources. They would take these stories and put biblical names to them.
Right.
So Solomon was given in, but no Jew would ever tell their kids, this is what happened to Solomon. If you want to know what happened to Solomon, come back to the scroll.
Absolutely.
Come back to this book.
Now, in Quran 27, 17 to 44, there is a story of Solomon and Bathsheba. Here the Quran says Solomon trained birds in battle to drop stones on enemies. Then Solomon could not find his hoopie bird, and he got upset. But the hoopie bird then came to Solomon, talking to him, and told him about this woman named Queen Bathsheba. Then Solomon sent the hoopie bird with a letter to give Bathsheba. After a quarrel, Bathsheba ended up at Solomon's palace, and when entering Solomon's court, she lifted up her dress, uncovering her legs, because she thought the floor was made of water, when really it was made of glass. Now, this exact tale comes from the earlier uninspired Jewish Second Targum of Esther, aka Targum Sheni, which says, quote, "One day the king Solomon, observing that the mountain cock or hoopie was absent, ordered that the bird be summoned forthwith. When it arrived, it declared that it had for 3 months been flying higher and thither, seeking to discover some country not yet subjected to Solomon, and had at length found a land in the east exceedingly rich in gold, silver, and plants, whose capital was called Ketor, and whose ruler was a woman known as the Queen of Saba, Sheba. The bird suggested that it should fly to the queen and bring her to Solomon. The king approved this proposal, and Solomon accordingly caused a letter to be tied to the hoopie's wing. On being informed of her arrival, Solomon sent his chief minister, Benaiah, to meet her, and then seated himself in a glass pavilion. The queen, thinking that the king was sitting in water, lifted her dress, which caused Solomon to smile, unquote. So clearly this is the exact story found in the Quran. Because of this Targum's reflection of persecution from Byzantine Catholics and due to linguistic reasons, the Targum expert Bernard Grossfield dates it to the early 7th century, at the end of the Byzantine period, before the rise of Islam. This dating is confirmed by the German scholar Beat Ego. In fact, the Encyclopedia of Religious and Philosophical Writings in Late Antiquity, edited by Jacob Neusner and Alan Jeffrey Avery Peck, notes most scholars today agree with this dating. Since this Targum was composed prior to the rise of Islam and later spreading of the Quran, it could not have borrowed the story from the Quran. The Quran borrowed the silly tale from the Targum orally.
Favorite one is chapter 27, verse 17 to 44. This is the story of Solomon and Sheba, and this is the story I must have missed in Sunday school, because this story is a lot more exciting. According to the Quran, Solomon was marching his birds, getting them ready for battle, and they would fly up over the enemy, and they would drop a stone onto the enemy with the name of the enemy they're going to kill on the bottom. The first Air Force ever invented, Solomon. Did you know that? One day, as he's marching his bird, getting them ready for battle, he notices that the one bird, the hoopoe bird, his favorite bird, is missing. And he gets angry, and then he sees it flying in from the south and lands at his feet and talks to him. Lo and behold, Solomon can talk to birds. He asks him where he's been. He says, I've been down in the south. There's a gorgeous queen in the land of Sheba. You've got to go see her. He says, I'm way too busy. Why don't you fly on back down and bring her up? So he does that, flaps on back down to Sheba, lands at the foot of the queen of Sheba, talks to her. Lo and behold, she talked to birds. Why can't we do that today? Because we don't read the Quran. So she comes up with the bird up to the throne room where Solomon is sitting on his throne. She comes in the door of the throne. As she's about to cross to meet him, she sees a pond in the middle of the floor, and she pulls up her skirts to keep them from getting wet. And that's where it ends in verse 44. How many have heard this story before? In your Bible? Not in your Bible. So where have you heard it? Do you know the source for this? This is right up there on the screen. Just look. Second Targum of Esther. This is a well-known account. Almost exactly the same story that's in the Quran, you will find the second Targum of Esther, except for the very end. At the very end of the second Targum of Esther, as she's crossing and as she pulls up her skirts, she has hairy legs. When Solomon sees the hairy legs, he cries out in surprise. That is kept out of the Quran for obvious reasons.